All right. Okay, so I've got the recording started. We've got another couple of minutes, and then we'll get started right at 12 o'clock Central for everybody. And the attendees are coming in now. And you and I's last exchange, Dr. Tallamy, was about the snow that we had here in Central Texas. And we're supposed to get snow mix again this weekend with a low of 20 degrees on Saturday that I am not looking forward to.
You'll survive. You'll survive.
Well, I live in the South for a reason. I don't like the cold.
A couple of days from now, it's supposed to go down to 9 for us. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
I think you've had more snow than we have.
Yeah, you can have it back.
Only about 3 inches here.
I think it snowed twice where Michelle's at. I know she had the New Year's Eve snow, New Year's Day snow, and we didn't get that over here on the east side of the state. All right, well, I'm going to kick us off. I'm seeing 11:59, 12 o'clock, and we're going to try and use your time to the best of our ability today, knowing that you have a lot of wisdom to share. So we're going to jump right into this with all the folks that are on, and then there's still a few more that are joining us. For the Master Naturalist, thank you guys so much for being here for our TMN Tuesday series. This is a monthly series that we're hosting, and there's the lunch bell. It's 12 o'clock. This is a monthly series. This is what you get when you live in small town Texas. This is the lunch bell. So our TMN Tuesday series is a new series that we're hosting this year on the second Tuesday of the month. And this month we're obviously highlighting Dr. Doug Tallamy with Are You Nature's Best Hope? We're so excited to have you here, and we're going to run through our virtual meeting room etiquette real quick, and then I'm going to pass it over to you. As our attendees are joining today, you'll notice that you cannot unmute or show your video, and this is on purpose. We have over 1,000 folks registered for today's event, and we're really excited to have both Master Naturalists and non-Master Naturalists joining us today. And those of y'all that are not Master Naturalists, welcome to this series. We're excited to have you as part of our audience today. And you can see my voice, my mouth moving, but you can't hear me. A few quick steps to check your audio settings is to go to the menu at the top that says audio. Make sure that you have your correct speaker selected. Make sure that your speakers are plugged in and turned on, and then turn that volume up so that you can hear Dr. Tallamy today. Additionally, we have a Q&A room open, a Q&A box open to ask questions. Dr. Tallamy is going to share his presentation, and then at the end of the hour is going to ask if there are questions. Michelle, Addison, and I are all going to be monitoring that Q&A room. As questions come in, we will save them until the end, and then we will verbally ask those questions to Dr. Tallamy, knowing that we will not be able to ask all of the questions that get submitted, and we will hold on to those and hopefully select wisely the questions that we get to ask you today. And please select Ask to All panelists so that all of us get to see those questions. Finally, I'm going to leave this screen up here for just a quick second, but we do have a help center that's available if you can grab a phone real fast and take that picture, and I'll drop that phone number into the Q&A box here in just a second as well. And then finally, before we get started, just setting the ground for our virtual meeting room etiquette. Attendees are not able to unmute during the WebEx event. Please use the Q&A box to ask all questions. Our Q&A box is open for on-topic discussion only. Please be professional and respectful in all of your questions and comments made in that Q&A box. And we will, again, verbally ask those questions of Dr. Tallamy as time permits. This session will be for 1.5 hours and will be recorded today. The recording is already started, and I'll be posting that recording to our TMN Tuesday website by the end of the day today. And then we also have additional WebEx help on that TMN Tuesday website. And then with that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for today's February series for the TMN Tuesday. For the TMN Tuesday series, Dr. Doug Tallamy joined us in October at our annual meeting, and with rave reviews, we just could not help but ask for an encore presentation for this year's TMN Tuesday series. Dr. Tallamy is a professor at the University of Delaware and author of numerous books, with a new one coming out this year, which I'm hoping that you're going to highlight for us today. I think I pre-ordered that one already from Amazon. And then a founder of the Homegrown National Park program. And I'm hoping that you can explain a little bit about that Homegrown National Park towards the end of the presentation as well today. And with that, I promised a short and sweet introduction so that we can give you the most of the time today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Dr. Tallamy, and I'm going to pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you. Take that away.
It should be yours.
Yep. Oh. Okay, how do we look?
You look fantastic.
You look good?
I mean, the bird looks fantastic.
Okay, good. All right, well, it is a pleasure to be here today. I want to talk to you about my idea for what nature's best hope is. I want to try to minimize my face up here. Will that work? It will. Okay, good. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about something that happened on the East Coast, from Massachusetts all the way down to Georgia, not this fall, but the fall before that. We had what we call an oak mast. All the members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. This is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I am easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it made a little hole and forced its head through. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. Tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down. This is a very dangerous time for that insect because it is a wonderful thing to eat. Everybody wants to eat it. So it's got to get to safety by wriggling and squirming below the surface of the soil. And it does that quickly, about 30 seconds, down it goes, where it stretches in all directions and makes a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and then stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. Now, a lot of people think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and they chew a hole down into the center of the acorn and turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that's how the larva gets to the center of the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year like most insects? Well, red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. When they leave, of course, that leaves a hole in the acorn. It is a true vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants that live within the vacated holes made by acorn weevils in acorns. And if they find a brand new hole, they get excited because their old acorn's falling apart. They want to move their new colony in, and they do that immediately. They send the messengers out. They start to carry the larvae. Everybody works very hard. And within about 30 minutes, they have moved into the new acorn. And they set up a guard right there at the entrance to make sure nobody else comes in. Well, at this time, my wife says, "What is your point? What are you trying to tell us?" What I'm trying to tell you is that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that make up most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Actually, all over the world, jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They fly up to 2 miles from the parent tree and bury the acorn under the ground. The idea is they're going to go get it in the wintertime. That'll be good food for them. But jays do not have perfect memories, and it turns out that they end up planting an awful lot of oak trees every single year. Found out what is really pollinating our witch hazel this fall. If you read in the book, it says witch hazel is pollinated by flies and fungus gnats. But every single time I looked at a witch hazel flower, I never saw anything. Witch hazels, of course, are shrubby trees that bloom in the fall, very late in the fall, as a matter of fact. And it turns out that there's a group of moths called the winter moths. This is one of them, the bicolored sallow. and they turn out to be the primary pollinators of witch hazel. These winter moths fly really late, just like the witch hazel blooms really late. As a matter of fact, I caught a bicolored sallow on Christmas Eve this year. There was snow on the ground. But I don't know whether the winter moths are flying late to take advantage of witch hazel or whether witch hazel is blooming late to take advantage of winter moths. But at this point, they're both taking advantage of each other. You won't have breeding pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you're not going to have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have over 4,000 species of native bees, and at least a third of them are highly specialized. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. So where I live, there are about 13 species of native bees that can only reproduce on perennial sunflowers. And in Texas, there are many more. In California, there are 60 species that use perennial sunflowers. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead, and on and on and on. So nature really is a series of many, many specialized relationships. But today, these types of relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice very seriously. Way back in 1908, he heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, he looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that today we can't leave most of the country as it was because we haven't left it that way. There's only about 5% of the 48 states, lower 48 states, it's anything close to its original pristine condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly, we've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to support the species, sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we humans all depend on. Why have we done this? I guess we thought the earth was so big, our nest was so big, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing very scary headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? We're talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population gone. Now the UN is predicting that we will lose 1 million species to extinction, totally gone, and possibly within the next 20 years. And I love the way they report it as if this is just another headline. They might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and let's go on to another headline, because this is not an option, folks. This is not an option. Well, I could go on and talk about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from many people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great E.O. Wilson, probably the most famous biologist alive today, certainly the most famous entomologist, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very simple, and that is that life, as we know it, depends on insects. And if insects were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants on the planet. They would go extinct. And if that happened, the energy flow through our terrestrial habitats would be altered so drastically that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals would all collapse. And those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because of the loss of insect decomposers that as of now rapidly turn over nutrients. All we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive those drastic changes. The good news is we can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why do we have to do that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on nature. We're totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services. Those are the services that we derive from healthy ecosystems. So for example, what do plants give us? How about the production of oxygen? Pretty important. Clean water, really important. This is a big one today, carbon capture. It's plants that are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, locking it up in their tissues. They lock the carbon up in their tissues and then pump the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have pumped into the ground over the eons. Plants also build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds, and again, other things. So designing landscapes like this that do not produce ecosystem services, actually they destroy the production of ecosystem services, that's simply no longer an option. It never was a good option. But today with 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, it's a terrible option. We don't have land like this to waste. Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent visionaries of our times, our recent times, who recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And he wrote extensively about that in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups who have been able to do that for long periods, but our giant Western societies and our giant Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely spoiling individual places. Then we move to another place and spoil it and so on. Well, Aldo recognized that that's not a sustainable solution to life on Earth. So he had what he called a dream about developing a land ethic. He dreamt that we humans would actually learn how to use the earth gently. We would farm it, lumber it, graze it, mine it, do all the things we needed to do, but we would do it gently enough that we didn't destroy local ecosystems. And he called that developing a land ethic, and he wrote about it in Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist, can't be in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, and it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. But this afternoon, I want to argue that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not just exist, not scrape by, but thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to start? Well, let's go back to private property. We cannot ignore private property in future conservation efforts because so much of the world is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I think 95% of Texas is privately owned. If we ignored private property, we're working on tiny little spaces that, again, are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that we need them to sustain. But there are lots of areas that we don't typically think of as potential conservation centers that could be. Here are a few of them. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? We got 21 million acres in power line and pipeline rights of ways. That's as of 2014. So we actually have a lot more than that right now. Railroad rights of ways, 3 million acres. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Roadsides, another 17 million acres down here. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge areas. Then we have all the places we live, both in rural areas and suburbia and cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those places. If you add that up, that's 599 million acres that is not being used for conservation, but could be. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's big. It's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, and Texas, all added up. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation just about anywhere. And what we really need to do is rebuild nature where we have dismantled it. We're not talking about conserving little pockets that are left. We want to do that, but I'm talking about reconstructing functional ecosystems. And we have to do that by rebuilding those specialized relationships that I talked about earlier. Now, not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most important species, the species that other species depend on. And that really boils down to two groups. We have those flowering plants that are essential, first, the first trophic level, but you need the pollinators to create those or to maintain those flowering plants. So we must have ecosystems that have those pollinators. And we also have to, once the plants capture energy from the sun and turn it into food, we have to get that energy from plants to the animals that need it. Otherwise, it's a dead-end food web. And most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something typically is insects. But it turns out that caterpillars are the most important insects in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals, more important than any other type of animal. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars, most of the energy ends up being stuck in the leaves of plants. And that's it. That's the end. There's nothing else out there. So let me give you an example. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee a couple times in this talk because we have a lot of data on chickadees. They are seed eaters during the winter. At least 50% of their diet is seeds. That's why they're at your feeder right now. But when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. That's true for most of the birds that are out there. Can't eat seeds, so they switch to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they'll rear their young exclusively on insects. And chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do we know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that. But here's a citizen science project that my recent PhD student, Ashley Kennedy, finished just not long ago. She put out a call to nature photographers, bird photographers, to take pictures of birds as they were bringing food to the nest and send those pictures to her. And the idea was that she would identify the prey items that are in the beaks of the birds and then reconstruct the nestling diet of the major bird families in North America. So what you're looking at here are 20 bird families that she had enough data for, that she got thousands of pictures to do this with. And the green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the diets. So again, what would happen to our breeding birds if we took caterpillars out of the system? Well, something's obviously special about caterpillars. What is it? It's a couple things are special. One of them is that they're relatively soft prey items. Think of this guy as a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, not digestible. So the birds don't want a lot of cuticle. And because they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do fly around and chase aphids, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They're nutritious. They're very high in protein, very high in fat, very low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure I eat lots of carrots to get my beta carotene and lots of tomatoes to get my lycopene, lots of whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I do eat those things because they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a healthy immune system. Carotenoids are also antioxidants that run around our body, protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about things like this male prothonotary warbler who has had access to lots of luteins. And he's taken those luteins and made pigments out of them, put them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. But where are they getting their carotenoids from? Again, from what they're eating, and during the breeding season, it's what they bring back to the nest. But you can see carotenoid levels are not equal in various bird prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have by far the most carotenoids compared to other prey items. Third bar are orthopteroids, things like grasshoppers, crickets, and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids in the adults because they're not eating green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but it doesn't get any carotenoids when it gets the worm. Does carotenoid level in prey influence the way birds hunt for prey? Well, Ashley did another study with bluebirds. She took GoPro cameras, put them on the rooftops of bluebird houses, and those cameras took a picture once every second. The object was to get a picture of the bluebirds as they flew into the house with prey. And she had a lot of GoPro cameras and a lot of bluebird houses, and she did it for 3 years. So she had well over 1 million pictures to go through. But out of that 1 million pictures, she got 7,628 pictures that were good enough where she could identify the prey item and construct this graph. And sure enough, caterpillars were brought back more often than anything else, and they've got the highest level of carotenoids, followed by those orthopteroids. They've got the next highest. And then everybody else is nestled down here. So yes, it suggests that carotenoids may be important in terms of prey choice. But what it really suggests is that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. It's really looking like they're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. Okay, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. We've got data on how many caterpillars it takes to make a clutch of chickadees. 1 or 2 is not enough. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And then after they leave the nest, parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all over the place, so nobody can count those. So you're talking about many, many thousands of caterpillars to produce 1 clutch of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if we want these birds breeding in our yards, we have to have all those caterpillars in our yards. We do want them breeding in our yards because that's pretty much all that's left in an awful lot of places. The birds are not, they forage about 50 meters from the nest. They don't fly 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. So we need these caterpillars in our yard if we're going to sustain bird reproduction. And if we don't landscape in a way that creates that many caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really starting to look like that is closely linked to bird decline. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. Those are the guys that said we have lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial birds up into birds that require insects at some part of their life history and birds that do not. So things like finches and doves can actually reproduce on seeds. They gained a few numbers per species, but the birds that rely on insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species during the last 50 years. Now, this does not prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest there is a tight link between the health of the local insect population and the health of your local bird population. I'm going to conclude from this that it is time we start landscaping for caterpillars, which is a brand new goal for landscaping. In the past, we've landscaped in a way that made sure we had no insects in our yards, but that was the old days. The new days here, we're going to landscape in a way that creates caterpillars by adding the plants that create those caterpillars. That seems easy enough, except there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars because most caterpillars are really fussy about what they eat, which means we have to be very selective and choose the plants that are good at making caterpillars. And of course, Mr. Monarch Butterfly here represents that really well. You can have all the crepe myrtles and all the camellias and all the boxwoods and all the burning bushes and all of the calorie pear, anything from Asia you want to put in your yard, and you won't have a single monarch being produced in your yard because the only thing they're going to be produced on is milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them specialize. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those leaves. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the leaves. They're simply too well protected. And if you don't believe me, as soon as the plants come out, go out and eat a plant. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. Every single plant lineage is protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. That's a little joke. This is not a joke. Plants or insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? This is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And insects can't adapt to all those cocktails. So they pick one or two and they get really good at getting around those by developing enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. And it allows them to eat those plants without dying. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. It doesn't happen overnight. And that is why our native insects are very poor at eating the plants that we bring in from other continents. They've never seen them before in their evolutionary history. They don't have the adaptations necessary to get around their defenses. So what I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to reconstruct food webs in areas where we've deconstructed them, we have to choose the right plants. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when you choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres on an area that was an old farm. And I mean old, it was farmed just about 300 years before they sold it. Soil was totally exhausted. The last thing they did was to mow it for hay. But in our area of Pennsylvania, mowing for hay really is mowing a bunch of invasive Asian plants and calling it hay, like multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and autumn olive and miscanthus. Just mow it all up, call it hay. So, of course, when we built the house, they stopped mowing, and this is what came back, all the rootstocks of what they were mowing. The entire property was just a giant tangle of Asian plants. This is my wife, Cindy, getting ready to get rid of all this stuff. She cleared the 10 acres very successfully. It's hard. There's no doubt about it, but she enjoyed the work. And if you have a bad invasive plant problem, don't give up. Cindy has proven that you really can do it. What was I doing while she was working hard? I was telling her she was doing a great job, but I was also putting plants back. And I focused on plants, put a lot of plants back, but I wanted to see if I could attract particular species of caterpillars that I'd never seen before. I'd like to take pictures of new caterpillars. And this was one I tried, the Canadian owlet. That's what its adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, if you want Canadian owlets, you have to have meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. Used to be here, but a couple hundred years ago probably, but no meadow rue now. So I got some seeds, planted meadow rue, grew very nicely. But you know, this was early on. I really didn't think any Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't go out and check it for over a month and a half. And finally I walked by accidentally, and my patch of meadow rue was almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. So I was surprised, but that, you know, now we have a good population of meadow rue and good population of Canadian owlets. So we have added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful yellow moth, that's actually a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some Bidens close by, 14 miles away in a power line cut. I got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. Well, it took about a year for the moths to actually find my Bidens, but they did find it. Now we have a good population of both. So we've added 4 species now. I wanted the hackberry emperor. It's a butterfly that ought to be here, but as the name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. We had to wait 3-4 years before the adult butterflies found our hackberry and started to produce a population. But they have succeeded. I walked by one of my hackberries this June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillar on a single branch. So big success there. So now we've added 6 species, and this is how it goes. I did not plant goldenrod. came in on its own, but along with the goldenrod came the species that use it, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. And that's what its larvae look like. I don't know why. I don't know why they haven't found our goldenrod. But this is anticipation. Every year I anticipate finding the goldenrod flower moth. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. And one of these days, it's going to come out of the bottle. I will find the goldenrod flower moth, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like Virginia creeper, but I'm not sure why. It can climb our trees without hurting them, without girdling them, without pulling them down, has good fall color. And it's the major host plant for a lot of our sphinx moths, particularly the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, and those in turn are the primary source of food for cardinals when they're breeding. Of course, many other things as well. Wanted to see if I could get the zebra swallowtail in our house, and this was pushing it because we're at the northern limit of zebra swallowtails. They, of course, are specialized on pawpaw, and we didn't have any pawpaw, so we planted pawpaw. But the nearest population I know of is 26 miles south of us. And, I just didn't know if they would make it this far up north, but it took them a while. We waited 9 years before the first zebra swallowtails came, but they have come at this point. In the meantime, we got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx. And, of course, lots of pawpaws. Wanted the double-tooth prominent because it's one of our coolest looking caterpillars. It's a specialist on native elms, so I planted American elm. It came right away. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. So we planted evening primrose, and the moth came. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And we planted lots of oak trees. And these are just examples of the plants we put on our property, but I want to focus on oaks because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. It is enormous. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. But, a lot of people think that your oak has to be enormous before it can contribute to your property. And I hear all the time, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, unless you die before the next year, you can enjoy your oaks right away, even if you plant them as acorns. And I can verify that because that's how I planted my oaks, acorns or 2-foot bare root whips. And right away, you can enjoy what they bring to your property. This is what they brought to our property. Some of what they brought. The solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more moths have come to the oaks on our property, even though we planted them as acorns. And we even got the burning meme caterpillar the other day. Even though it's wintertime, they wear gloves, so it's okay. And they come right away. This is a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves. So your oaks start to contribute immediately and start to build the biodiversity on your properties as soon as you put them in the ground. This picture is taken from the same place I took the other picture just a few years ago. I'm sitting in this window right here. We've got lawn, we're very traditional, but it's just to emphasize we put plants back on our property. And every time I add a new lineage of plant to the property, I get new species of moths. And 4 years ago, I made it a challenge to count all the species of moths I could find. These are ones I photographed on our property. And I am up to 1,031 species of moths so far. And we're not through. Every time we look, we find new ones. So that's 1,031 species of moths on 10 acres. Now, Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the property size, we're supporting 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is more than all of the birds that occur in North America, all the bird species. So you're talking about a lot of biodiversity there. And since each one of those is a type of bird food, we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, 59 species of terrestrial birds, which is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that breed in Pennsylvania. In other words, it works. I saw this headline, you probably did too, this past fall, that World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of the Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. And I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure that we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take nearly that long. So I offer this as encouragement. Don't give up. You see these frightening headlines. We can turn it around if we put the right plants back. It's that simple. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. Maybe you don't. You live in suburbia on a smaller plot of land. Will it work there? Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres. So that's 18 times less property than what Cindy and I have. And in Kirkwood, Missouri, the major invasive plant is bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did when they bought their 0.6 acres is to get rid of their bush honeysuckle. Their neighbors, by the way, have big lawns. It's a very traditional suburban neighborhood. They planted a lot of the native plants then, and they put in what they call a bubbler, a water feature. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that were using their property. And they're up to 149 bird species that have used their property, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Yes, it does. How about in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Right over this wall here is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. She has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller lot size than the average lot size in North America. And there's no connectivity with Pam's beautiful yard here and any other type of wild space. She is an island in Chicago. But she put in 60, she got rid of her invasive species, put in 60 species of native plants, another water feature, and then she sat back and started to count the birds that have used her property, and she's up to 117 species of birds. Got the great horned owl the other day, but that includes a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. But what about city centers? 82% of us now live in cities. Are all those people going to be out of luck? Well, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed, way back in 2014. And, you know, butterfly weed, that reminds me, we've got a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed anymore. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was staring at Monarch's Delight 2014, and the first thing I saw was 2 species of megachilid bee. I know those are leafcutter bees. I know they're leafcutter bees because they collect their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. Well, leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they need soft leaves, like leaves of red buds, so they can cut out the edge of the leaf with their mandibles, and then that leaves these little semicircles. Then they roll up those semicircles into a tube, stuff it full of pollen, lay an egg on it, and that is where their larvae develop. So this is a picture from Heather Holmes' work. These are 3 successive tubes created by leafcutter bees, stuffed with pollen, the eggs in there, and the larvae is developing. And then they stuff the whole thing into a crack or crevice. I always find them, unfortunately, in the snout of my watering can. That's not good. So they were there because there was a redbud growing right next to Monarch Delight. They had everything they needed. And I think that's why bumblebees were there as well. You know, queen bumblebees overwinter, but the workers don't. They all die in the fall. So in the queen, it's only in the spring, it's only the queen that is there, and she has to do all the work to start the colony. So in order to succeed, she needs abundant flowers to provide, ready access to pollen and nectar, so she can get her colony going. And there were bumblebees there, and I'm sure the redbud had a lot to do with it. Then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs foraging on Monarch's Delight. Now remember, this is 2014. 2013 was the low point of the monarch population, and I had gone the entire year without seeing a single monarch. And this was June. So seeing a monarch this far north in June is unusual for us. They usually don't get up here that fast. So I was encouraged. It looked like maybe we weren't going to lose all our monarchs after all. Why were they there? Well, they had Monarch's Delight, but they had, this is purple milkweed was there as well. So they had forage, but they also had their host plant. They were there to reproduce. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, New York City. High Line is an elevated railroad, an abandoned railroad that was abandoned for years. And finally, somebody went up there and saw there were a bunch of native plants growing. So they turned it into a tourist destination. And now it's very popular. Millions of people go to the High Line every year. So it's always crowded. And this is the strip of nature on the High Line. It's a little, 3-foot planting along the edge of this boardwalk here. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go to the High Line to see the pretty plants. I'm not much of a city boy. And going and seeing pretty plants with nothing using them is actually depressing to me. So I dragged my feet, but finally he got me there. And I was wrong. I saw lots of things using the plants. Somebody's just finished a study of the bees of the High Line. They're up to 30 species that are using it, 30 species of native bees on this little teeny strip in the middle of Manhattan. So I'm impressed. If thoughtful native plantings can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, we can do this anywhere. But there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to be successful. And the first one is we've got to shrink the area we have in lawn because we got too much lawn. We've got over 40 million acres nationwide, which is bigger than the size of New England. And of course, the way we treat it, it's an ecological deadscape. It's there as a status symbol. I understand we humans need our status symbols, but let's cut the status symbol in half. We can still manicure it. We can still project the image that we are good citizens and we're following our culture. But let's get some plants back in half the area that's in lawn. And if we do that in half the area, that'll give us another 20 million acres to work with for conservation. And if we do this at home, we can create a new national park that we call Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up Bola's Park, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country by far. What are the benefits of building Homegrown National Park? Well, you can actually develop a personal relationship with nature, either for the first time or redevelop one that you might have had when you were a child. And you could do it at your own time and your own pace. You could do it avoiding crowds. If you go to a real national park, millions of people there, no admittance fee. It is free. And it's never closed, depending on it doesn't matter what pandemic comes down the road. It's never closed. No travel hassles. The big one is you get to experience the natural world, some level of the natural world alone. And I think that's so important. I think it's absolutely necessary to developing that personal relationship with nature. And it's certainly necessary for our kids. Richard Lewis tells us our kids are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we're trying, we get 30 kids and put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour and walk around a natural area. Teacher tells them not to touch anything, and then they get back in the bus and they drive home. And that's their experience with the natural world. And I guess it's better than nothing, but it's really an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature in their own yard, all they have to do is go outside, but go outside alone and interact with nature. I want to emphasize alone, no parental supervision. Let them risk it. Most of them will make it back alive. And they might learn how to hunt lizards. Now, before we talk about lizards, I want to emphasize the importance of kids learning about the natural world, because they're going to be the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't have a relationship with what they're supposed to be stewarding, they're going to be lousy stewards. And right now they don't, believe me. But what about hunting lizards? I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very small patch of nature, and it's not all that natural. It's grass with a hedge. But there are anole lizards that live there. So she sent me this picture to explain how you hunt anole lizards. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch it, you put it in an aquarium, and you have this personal relationship. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be doing this the rest of her life, but I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the earth because of that experience. If you want to learn about other ways to interact with nature, get your kids to Get Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti. Dozens of great examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world. And if you want to get on Homegrown National Park, go to our new website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and follow the instructions. You put in your date of where you live and approximately the amount of area that you are committed to planting native plants in. or have already or have preserved. The object is to, then your area on the map is going to light up. And the object is to watch the map light up and watch connectivity build as we restore ecosystems in human-dominated spaces around the entire United States. And we talk about having a goal of 20 million acres, that half the area that's in lawn. But, why stop there? The country is much bigger than that. So we'll just keep going as long as people are interested. You can even get a little sign there, put it in your yard like Pam Carlson here. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put back where there was lawn? Some of them have to be what I call keystone plants. Now remember what a keystone is. You have the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. And if you take it out of the arch falls down. Keystone plants are so essential to food webs that if you take them out of the food web collapses. So a keystone plant is one that's making most of the food. And we have found out that just 5% of our native plants are making at least 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our local food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs, which means 85% of our native plants are contributing, but not all that much. So the question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? Certainly on average they are, but I can build an all-native landscape that contributes very little because there are a number of natives that are really well protected. The question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our yards or benign plants, or even worse, destructive plants, those invasive species that escape our gardens and then biologically pollute all the surrounding area? I get an email once or twice a year from somebody reminding me, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not our metric anymore. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. They're not a productive plant in terms of contributing to food webs. So they're taking up space, but they're not contributing. What is contributing the most? The top keystone plant in 84% of the counties of North America is one of the oaks, the genus Quercus. In the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillars. That's 557 species of bird food. In the entire country, that's 900 species of bird food. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. Here's the power of keystone oaks in our yard. So far, I've taken pictures of 1,031 moth species. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. I will. Out of that 1,031 species, 907 have known host plants. So there's over 100 that we don't know what they're eating. Out of the 907 that we do know what they're eating, 267 species use oaks. Now we have 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the oaks, Quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity, but they're supporting almost 30% of our moth species diversity, which means that goes right up the food web. So they're supporting an awful lot of our birds as well. That's the power of keystone oaks. Imagine what would happen if we took them out of our yard. How do you find out what the keystone species are for where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. So these are just examples of what you might find. This is for the Dallas area. It's a much bigger list than this, but I just ran out of room. So oaks are always at the top there, followed by prunus, salix, carya, the hickories, elms, maples, poplars. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. I say that because if you go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell you an Asian flowering cherry. If you say, I want to buy a willow, they're going to sell you weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy an elm, they'll probably sell you a Siberian elm or a Chinese elm. So be specific when you're asking. Even though these are native genera, they do have non-native members. And if we plant the non-native members, we reduce caterpillar use by 65%. We've done that experiment in the common garden. These are the top 3 herbaceous plants in terms of supporting caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting specialist pollinators. Solidagos, goldenrods are always very high, the various genera of asters, perennial sunflowers, very high. These alone, where I live, support over 40 species of native bees. And I know that there are more species of native bees out as we move farther west. So these are really important genera, not just for caterpillars, but also for those native bees. If you don't have them in your yard, that's 40 species of native bees that can't be there as well. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. And of course, that is not the goal here. There's research, a lot of it coming out of Europe, that suggests that light pollution is one of the major reasons for insect declines in the temperate zone around the world. So our lights at night are killing insects in a number of ways. Through exhaustion, the moths fly around until they just drop. Collisions, incineration, dehydration, the bat comes and eats them. Bright lights blind a lot of our night insects. Who knew? And it keeps them from doing what they're supposed to be doing on a daily basis. To me, this actually is really good news. Insect decline is a very serious problem. We've got to turn it around. And if this is one of the major causes, it's the easiest one to fix. All you have to do is turn your lights out, a flick of a switch. What could be easier? But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my lights out because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to find out is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to night insects than white wavelengths. And yellow LED lights are the least attractive. So overnight, if we switched if we turned our lights out or put in yellow LED light bulbs, we would save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars too, because this is the most efficient lighting you can get. All right, we're going to shrink our lawn, put in keystone plants, turn out our lights, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then kill them with mosquito gel. We have no end to the ways we like to kill insects. This is a serious problem nationwide, mosquito fogging. It's a giant industry now. We do it all summer long. And we do it all summer long because it doesn't work, which means we have to keep coming back and back and back. Studies have shown that this type of fogging kills about 10% of the adult mosquitoes. And to get control, you have to kill 90% of the adult mosquitoes. Mosquito Joe will tell you that it's a natural product, so it's okay. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. But cyanide is also a natural product, and it's not necessarily okay. He'll also tell you that it only kills mosquitoes. Not true. It kills all the insects that it comes in contact with. But the big thing is it doesn't work, and it's very expensive. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in straw or hay, and let it ferment for a couple of days. And that becomes irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes. They will lay their eggs in that bucket. Then you throw in a mosquito dunk that you get at the hardware store. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. And your mosquito larvae will chew on the dunk and they will die. So this is it's a cheap way to control mosquitoes. Everybody's got to do it, but it would work. If a dragonfly gets in there, not going to hurt them. If your dog licks it or if a bird drinks it, not going to hurt them at all. It only kills it only kills aquatic diptera. And in a case like this, it's going to be mosquitoes. So let's give that a try. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows our caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where there are 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the plant. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then he spins a cocoon and hangs from the branch, and then he emerges as an adult and does it all again. Well, I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94% of them, 480 species, drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil and form a pupa underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And we mow and trample our yards to the point where they're really compact, very difficult for the caterpillars to get underground. So this becomes an ecological trap. If this is a keystone plant, the adults lay their eggs here, the larvae develop and drop down and die. And the next generation smaller, and then the generation after that is gone altogether. I am convinced that this type of landscaping, which we do everywhere, is another major cause of insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities. I'm trying to discourage the profligate use of cement in our cities as a default landscape. That's just laziness, and we know it destroys our watersheds. This is what most people do. You have a big tree in the middle of a lawn, and nobody studied the ability of caterpillars to make it in a situation like this. But I guarantee it's better in a situation like this, where you have a tree, and then you have a layered landscape. You've got maybe a dogwood here, and then an azalea and ferns and ground cover. It's a safe site. The caterpillars can drop down, easily get below the ground because it's not compacted. Nobody's going to step on it. Nobody's going to mow them. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put big beds around your trees rather than grass right up to the tree. Another safe site. This is where you can use your ground covers like mayapple or wild ginger. That's what this is. Foam flower, ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. But look, safe sites. If there's caterpillars here, they drop down and they'll be okay. Another graduate student, Desiree Narango, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And one of the results was that it appears there is room for compromise in our plant choice. And that's important. What she did was look at how well landscapes that were dominated by native plants sustained chickadee populations versus landscapes that were dominated by introduced plants, those non-native ornamentals that we love so much. The landscapes dominated by introduced plants produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, those landscapes reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So there were nest boxes up in each of the suburban landscapes, but the chickadees would come and they'd look around and they knew there was not enough food there, so they didn't even try to reproduce there. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed by 1.5 days. And if you put all that together into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from nothing to 100%, that's what you get. The dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. And if you reproduce at this rate, it's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you reproduce over here, you're making more babies than adults die every year, and you have a growing population. But if you're down here, you've got an unsustainable population, a shrinking population. And right here is where those lines overlap. So generously speaking, we can have up to 30% of our woody plant biomass being non-native and still have sustainable populations. But if we exceed 30%, then we're down into this area here, and your chickadees will eventually disappear. But here's that area of compromise I'm talking about. You can have up to 30% of the biomass in your yard non-native, as long as it's not invasive, and you can still have sustainable breeding bird populations. So you can have that crepe myrtle if you absolutely need it without destroying the life around you, as long as it doesn't dominate the landscape. Remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. As long as we have the native plants there, these guys, as long as they are not invasive, are okay. Can native plants be used in formal landscapes? Of course they can. This is a garden in North Carolina. Somebody sent me this picture. They're replacing the plants in here with native plants. So here's Joe Pye. Notice I didn't say Joe Pye weed. It's not a weed. And they're going to do that for the entire garden, just to show you that you can have an all-native garden that is formally designed. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And that's okay, because they're non-native plants there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. Look at the number of species here that can satisfy different species of native bees. It's quite a bit of forage. It's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would be a constant source of pollen and nectar for our native bees. Let's just talk quickly about why we need pollinators. You hear all the time you need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about 1/12 of our crops. But that's not the reason we need pollinators. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. It's not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere. So right now people think, if I don't live next to a farm, I don't need pollinators. Yes, you do. Every place we need plants, we need pollinators. How about this design? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and they're doing it more and more. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that is encouraging homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, and they help you pay for it. Florida is encouraging homeowners in I guess it's an island off of Florida, to allow burrowing owls to burrow in your front yard, and if they do that, they'll pay you to allow them to do that. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of that species, rather than fine you if you do something with your property. Missouri had, I don't know if it's over at this point, but Fayetteville, Arkansas still has a bounty on calorie pears. One of the most basic plants we can put in our yard. If you take out a calorie pear, they'll give you a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. Just one in San Antonio, giving people $100 coupons to take out thirsty plants and putting in water efficient native plants. Buffalo, New York is giving people $100 coupons to increase the percentage of natives in the yard. It has nothing to do with water conservation. They just want to get more natives in. And the far west, California, is encouraging people to get rid of their lawn, replace it with xeric plant. You get $2 per square foot of rebate if you take out your lawn. Well, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And one of them is this. We've assumed that nature is important, but it's not essential. That's the misstep right there. So we like it, when it's convenient. But as soon as push comes to shove, when resources are short, which is always, nature loses because we don't think it's essential. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sock poster there that epitomizes to me what our society thinks of conservation. We want to save wildlife. We want to save nature for future generations. That's what Teddy Roosevelt said. We're going to create national parks so that future generations can enjoy them. And that's true enough, but it suggests nature's there just for our entertainment. It's much more urgent than that, folks. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. Much more urgent. Number 2, we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about this. If we only do conservation where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because that's doing it on too small an area. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and a functioning ecosystem. This is a functioning Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, including all of our human-dominated spaces. So we need to glue our rug back together again by putting the plants back into these no man's lands we've created in between viable habitat. We're not just going to create biological corridors where plants and animals can move back and forth. We're going to create viable habitat by using those keystone plants. In other words, we're going to share our spaces with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few ecologists, few conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. But I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of Indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're great at teaching this one, but we have been terrible at teaching our young people, our adults, that everybody has an obligation to good earth stewardship. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, although it is a good living, but you can save it where you live. And I love this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, today we got some big problems out there, and it's very easy to think that one person cannot make a difference, as the cliche suggests. But in this case, the cliche is right. One person can make a difference. Go outside, plant that oak, put in that pollinator garden, reduce the size of your lawn, get rid of the invasive species on your property. You will be able to see a vibrant ecosystem come back to your property, no matter how small it is, which makes you an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. You'll get depressed if you do that. Just focus on the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Volunteer for a land conservancy or a local park or preserve. They're all understaffed, underfunded. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. And I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. Hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Excellent, Dr. Tallamy. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I always just in awe when I hear you speak. So wanted to say thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
We have some great questions if you have time for us.
Yes, I do.
Okay. And it's interesting, our master naturalists have gotten down to the details of a lot of these questions, but I'm going to try and start with some of the big picture questions. And one that was sent in early was asking about what actions can let me make sure that I'm reading the right one. What actions can suburban and urban residents do in advocating in their neighborhoods and their communities at large to increase native plants? You talked about working on their own individual properties, but what can be done, and this was a question that we talked about last October as well, but what can be done when working with municipalities or other organizations that are large landowners and communities?
Okay, there's a lot there. You know, the most important factor in changing our behavior is what our peers do. So if you create a beautiful functional landscape, in other words, if you create a good model system, there's a chance that your neighbors will actually want to do the same thing just because you've done it. And if enough people do it and it becomes commonplace, then it definitely will change the culture, because we are followers. We love to follow the leaders. So you people can be the leaders. How do you get municipalities to change? You make it known that this is important to you. Every one of those people is elected and they want to keep their jobs. They claim that they're doing what their constituents want them to do. So make it known that you're a constituent and this is what you want. And that's why those other programs are popping up. People recognize it. Sometimes in terms of water conservation, it's so important in the West that it doesn't matter what the public wants. They've got to conserve water, and they've got that. But we're starting to learn that conserving biodiversity is equally important. It's not as obvious, but it's equally important. And the more we learn that, when people learn that they can actually do something to turn around those terrible headlines that we're seeing, a lot of people get on board. So help educate people. I mean, it's why I'm writing the books, to try to convince people that now is the time to act. You know, we're in the 6th grade extinction because of the hundreds of years that we haven't acted. So we all have to act together now. I do see, I've been working with this for over about 15 years now, and I do see a cultural shift. So there's hope. People are changing. I mean, look at all the people on the call today. You're here because you care. There's a lot of other people out there who will care if they understand what the problems are.
Yeah, it's interesting. A quote that has been ringing in my head through the last 2 weeks or so is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I thought that was such an interesting, and I'll have to send you the attribution. It was definitely not.
Yeah, I've never heard that, but that is so true. Wow.
Yeah, it rings really, really true to this specific scenario. One of the other questions that that I've seen here is, with a lot of the focus on growing at homes, what Robin asks if there is a targeted approach for communities in poverty. How can they work with the resources that they have access to, or what are resources that could be shared with those lower income neighborhoods or communities in need, where nature is probably at a much more limited access level, and even any nature of a native sort is rare, to say the least.
It's rare, and the resources to do it are even rarer. It's a big problem, and it's one I haven't spent a lot of time on. The California Native Plant Society has brought this up to me because there are a number of people concerned as well. It's coming off as a suburban white folk problem here, but it's not. It's everybody on the planet, and we do have to find ways to include everybody. And it really gets into sociology, which is not my area of expertise. So I guess finding ways to make it affordable, and a simple way is you plant plants when they're small, when they're cheap. Acorns are free. But you also need the property to do it in. For people who have so many other things to be worried about, again, nature takes a back seat because the payoffs, the results seem a lot more distant. It's a big problem, but the fact that we're aware of it is good news. But it's a sociological issue that really needs to be dealt with. That's a terrible answer, but that's all.
No, it's a bigger question than can be answered in a very short period of time. For sure. I want to ask just a few more questions. Again, I cannot say thank you enough. There are over 1,000 folks on the line with us today, and many more that we're trying to get in as well. And some of the more detail-oriented questions, of course, that come from our Master Naturalist. One is in transforming your, and I'm going to ask you two questions. In transforming your acreage, how did you decide where to start? And then one of the questions was more about the mechanics of clearing invasives. And then what do you set priority to when planting or choosing where to start?
Okay, well, we had 10 acres. Now I will say that we have a long flag lot property, which means you cannot see our property from the road. And that gives us tremendous freedom that a lot of people don't have. So I recognize that. So we did not start from a perspective of aesthetic design. Again, a lot of freedom there. Our main goal was to remove the major invasive plants on the property because they were everywhere, and then restore the property. And we focused largely on woody plants on both ends. So we got rid of the woody invasives and then started replacing them with woodies. When I say we, I'm talking about I planted a lot. But the blue jays and the squirrels, and mostly the blue jays and the squirrels, helped me a lot too. I mean, most of the beech trees on our property were planted by blue jays that fly in from someplace else, and we would pull out a multiflora rose bush. It left disturbed soil, and they'd tap the beech nut right below the surface there, and the next spring we'd have a baby beech tree. Then, of course, there was the goal of protecting these young plants from the deer, and I did that with cages. Where did we do this? Many of the plants, I would say 80% of the plants on our property came up where they came up. Again, it's where Mr. Blue Jay thought it was going to be good. And what I'm doing right now is editing, because one of the things we have learned is that plants grow, and they grow really fast. And on that 10 acres, we're losing sunlight in an awful lot of places. So I heat with a wood stove, and I'm getting all my wood from the property. And we've been here 20 years now, but that didn't take long. So again, that's a very functional approach to it. It's not an aesthetic approach. And if I had roadside frontage, I would have to be more careful about that. But it doesn't look bad. Anyway. What do we do about the invasives? My wife, Cindy, who did most of the work, won't touch herbicides. I will paint. I cut and paint. Because, if you don't kill the root systems, it comes back forever. She's happy to clip them forever, but I'm not. So particularly for the tough woodies like multiflora rose and autumn olive and bush honeysuckle and things, we cut at the base and paint an herbicide on the trunk. It's very little material. I look at herbicides as if it's chemotherapy. There's a lot of downsides to it, but there are serious downsides to not killing these plants as well. We wouldn't be nearly as far along in our restoration if we had not gotten rid of these invasives. So, that's our decision. But you can kill plant roots by starving them of nutrients, of energy, by cutting them back repeatedly. But that, by repeatedly, I mean like every 2 weeks. And if you have a substantial size property, it's just the labor is unimaginable. So that's what we've done.
Thank you. I'm trying to keep up with some of the questions that are coming in, so I apologize if I was reading through some of these questions. Caroline asks a really interesting question that I think speaks to the story of Zoe, and I love talking about your granddaughter. I love how you talk about her, and I love how you include her in your presentations. And I know you shared her snowman picture with me, or the snowball picture with me a while back as well. But talking about future generations and how to not only educate, some of the questions that I've seen, and I'm not going to ask a specific question because there's so many of them, but some of the questions are, how do we work with the education system to increase education on native and local ecosystems rather than far off ecosystems? And then Caroline's question is, what will happen to your property after you're gone?
Oh boy.
So, and I think the crux of my question here, and I'm trying to add two questions together, is looking at the generational shift that's going to occur in the US over the next 10 to 20 years. How do we educate and instill this culture for homegrown nature and pass that on?
Well, we have to start right away. I mean, you actually start with the parents so that when the kids get to kindergarten, it's not the first time they're hearing it. When your child is 2 years old and you're out in the driveway together, and if you see a worm and you scream and make sure they don't touch it, you're sending a message to that child that that's a dangerous, bad thing. And they'll remember that, even if they can't talk. So how we respond to the natural world before our kids even get to school is critically important. But once they're there, it's got to be part of all the curriculum. There are more and more people writing children's books with this message, and some of them are really good. Not enough, but it's starting, and that should be part of the general reading that our kids have as they're learning to read, so that, again, the message is there, reinforced over and over again. People have said, you got to make a video, you got to do something that's used in schools. I agree. I should do that, and maybe I will one of these days. But it's part of changing the culture. It's got to be part of it. It's got to be part of the culture. It's got to be what we tweet all the time. It's got to be part of Facebook. We can get kids in East Tiborg to buy Nikes, and we can do that overnight just by marketing campaigns. So if this becomes important, we can do that as well. And again, I see movement in that direction. I really do.
Yeah, I wrote down when you were talking about Zoe and sending her out alone. My daughter is 7, and there's so many times that she's out in the backyard just in a tree singing. That's her thing. But sending them out there without the fear of what the parents are not comfortable with is a big shift, and that would create a lot of positive energy.
We have a long way to go there because now in so many conditions, if somebody sees a child alone, they'll report the parent, and sometimes they get arrested for child abuse. I mean, it's really different from when we grew up.
Yeah. And that starts with just education. And that's a lot of what our master naturalists do, is educating the public
Good.
about the natural world around them,
Yeah.
to create a comfort and a recognition of that natural world. I'd love to ask a few more questions. I know we've got just a few more minutes of your time this afternoon.
Okay, I'll stay as long as you want.
Oh, don't say that, because there's 155 questions right now.
I'll stay till wine time, and then that's it.
There's been a few questions in here about lights and your discussion on lights, and I'm not going to capture all the questions, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Rhonda's asked, would you recommend using lights to attract insects to feed bats over the winter? There's some questions about multicolor lights. And then just, I guess, will you expand upon your point about lights?
Mercury vapor lamps, which are commonly used in those big security lights, are the very worst. So if you study moths and you want to collect the most moths, that's what you use, a mercury vapor lamp, and they all come in. So if you have one of those, get rid of that. The yellow wavelengths really do reduce it a tremendous amount. So your front porch light, the garage lights, all these lights that we have on by habit, I'm not sure we even think about why we have them on. They can all be yellow bulbs. Our street lights can be changed to yellow bulbs. So when you look at that night map of the US with all the lights on, we are lighting up the world. I would not recommend attracting insects so you can feed the bats. Bats don't hunt by eyesight anyway. So they find the insects when they're flying around using their sonar, radar, whatever it is. And if there are more insects out there, the bats will be able to find them. If we use lights, we're killing them, and then there's fewer insects. That's what hurts the bats, is a reduction in insect numbers. Not just bats, but things like the night jars, so whippoorwills and chuckwills, widows. They eat night flying insects, particularly the large moths, and their populations are down 95% because of the loss of large moths. So we want to build the insect populations up, and the things that eat them will respond to that. Excuse me. I'm done with that.
I'll let you take a drink there.
I'm just joking, that's all.
It's fine. That's fine. You'll be fine. Some of the other questions that have come in have been asking about the books that you mentioned, and I've lost the Nature Play at Home. Could you expand on that a little bit, and then maybe tell us? I have not spent a whole lot of time researching the certification process or the submission process on your Homegrown National Park website, but I would love to do that, get a designation like that for my own front yard. And then that ties into a question, again, I'm trying to get a bunch of questions answered, about the efficacy of putting certification signs from some of these native habitats associations or organizations like your own, and what that does to teach the public.
Okay, let's start with that one. Well, first of all, we don't, it doesn't cost anything to join Homegrown National Park. You don't become a certified member. Your data will go up on the map, and that's supposed to be good enough. It's supposed to be a social media thing where your neighbors, a woman sent me an email the other day saying, did you know that my county has more people on the map than any other county? She's excited about that. It's a competitive thing, and that's what we want to get people to join up. But it's not the same as joining National Wildlife Federation or Audubon, where there is a membership fee and you get a magazine and all that. We're not doing any of that. We call it a push-pull. We're pulling people in. I push, pulling people in, educating them through the website why this is important, and then pushing them out to service organizations that'll supply the services they need to do it, like National Wildlife Federation and Audubon and all the other wild ones, all the other master naturalists, all the groups that are going to actually provide the training. So this is really to generate interest. Do signs work? Yes, apparently they do. You put a sign in your yard, and it it makes it culturally acceptable. It shows that what you're doing there is intentional. It's planned. You have a goal. You're helping wildlife. And once people realize that and get it out of this is negligence. So many people think if you don't have a manicured lawn, you're being negligent. You say, no, I'm not. I've got a real purpose here, and I'm helping all those declining birds. Apparently that changes a lot of people's minds. There are also ways to do it that include cues for care, like 1 mower's width of mowed turf along your sidewalk or your driveway. Again, shows this is an intentional design, that you haven't moved out. You're still there being a good citizen. And that can change a lot of people's minds. I forget the rest of the questions you asked. You asked instead of them in one.
There was a question about the nature play at home.
The nature play at home, that's Nancy Stranisti. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but look for that book, and she's got dozens of examples of how you can expose kids to the natural world right at home. I mean, that's the goal. A field trip is one thing, but again, that's always there's always parental supervision. There's no freedom to develop that relationship in an organized event like that. We want kids to be able to go outside and just make it up. Just be imaginative. Just play. You bump into that salamander accidentally, and that's fascinating. You learn all about it and follow it, and those are the types of interactions we want to encourage.
Yeah, thinking of Michelle's daughter bringing stray ground snakes into the house, and just all of the fun creatures that come into the house from pockets.
And she survived all of that, right?
Exactly.
Good.
Well, we've got just another minute or so. There's a few more questions about your books that you have. And I mentioned at the very beginning that I believe I pre-ordered an oak book on Amazon.
I actually have it right here, called The Nature of Oaks. It's coming out the end of March. I don't know if you can see it, The Nature of Oaks.
We can, yeah.
So why did I write that? I like oaks. Oaks are really important, but the goal was what it does is follow the life that are on the oaks in our yard every month of the year. I wanted to take the oak tree and make it more than a tree. I wanted you to see what the community of life associated with that oak is right in your yard. And you created it by planting that oak. So it's showing you the results of the life you can bring to your yard with this single type of tree. Now, I could have written that for almost any species of tree that we have out there. But oaks do, they do 3 of the 4 things every property has to do better than any other tree. So they support food webs better than any other tree. They sequester carbon better than any other tree. They manage watersheds with their giant root systems better than most plants. The only thing they don't do better than other plants is support pollinators, because they're wind pollinated. But there's so many superlatives associated with oaks that I just thought I would write that book. Increase the appreciation. Again, it's knowledge. Knowledge generates interest, and interest generates compassion. Maybe it's the other way. Interest generates knowledge, one of those. But you end up with compassion. And that's when you start taking care of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, are there any final words of wisdom that you have for our Master Naturalists? And we have, out of the 1,000 or so folks that were able to attend today, about a third of them are non-Master Naturalists. And so we're excited to have them here with us, and hoping that they're motivated after today's presentation to join our organization or other conservation organizations.
I hope so too. I don't know about wisdom, but I'm never short of words. I think the most important thing today is to convince people that they are nature's best hope. They are, they have a role in conservation, and they can execute that role, rather than being just a member of the planet and hoping somebody else does it. We all can do, even if it's, just one tiny little thing. If everybody does it, that's 7.9 billion tiny little things that add up. So you're important. You're important. Nature's depending on you. That's my final message.
I love that. Well, thank you, Dr. Tallamy, so much.
welcome.
I
You're
can't
welcome.
say enough. Again, your presentation in October inspired all of our Master Naturalists that we had to have you back, and we cannot say thank you enough for your time again today.
You're quite welcome. All right.
Well, and with that, we're going to end this, and I'm going to say thank you to all of our attendees that are with us today and that joined throughout today's presentation. Our TMN Tuesday series is the second Tuesday of each month. We will share our Tuesday presentation within the next couple of weeks or so, and hope to see you guys back online next month. Thank you so much.
And just before we go, we recognize, we've been told that there were some technical difficulties with people getting online today. We are aware of that. We apologize, and please pass our apologies to your friends. The recording of the event will be on our website as soon as it processes and gets posted. That could be the end of the day, it could be the morning. So our TMN Tuesdays are available to our Master Naturalists to watch recorded, and they count as an advanced training for you when watching them recorded on our website. That is the exception to our policy on online advanced training. So please pass that note along to your friends who were not able to get in today.
Yep. With that, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and save everything. And again, can't say thank you enough, Dr. Tallamy.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.